What do you think of when someone mentions a pit bull? Do vaguely suspicious images like these come into your mind? If you're like me, and most other people, someone put those images in there. In recent weeks, certain folks on Twitter have been pushing an anti-pit bull narrative that's filled with half-truths, bad research, and lots of other fear-mongering. If you've been following the news about pit bulls over the last few decades, you might think they've co-opted a legitimate controversy around the pit bull. But the stigma attached to pit bulls go deeper than that. This new wave of anti-pit bull rhetoric is tired garbage, cosmetically altered with minimal effort. Which brings me to this video by Brittany Venti, The Pit Problem. While going through this video, I'll spare you any and all images of animals or children being mauled. If you're interested in checking out Venti's video, be warned, it has a lot of that in there, and it literally just goes right into it, no warning. So here's that warning for you. Like all great thought leaders, Brittany Venti was motivated to make this video after she saw a sign on a truck and some memes posted on the internet.
I never really thought about doing a video until now, and I think now is the perfect time to do so. There's trucks driving around New York with LCD screens saying to ban pit bulls, and Petco just banned pit bulls from playing with other pets at their stores. And I've seen a lot of anti-pit bull memes in the past few months.
Pit bulls, like she sort of mentions in her video, were bred from bulldogs. Bulldogs were originally bred in England for the hideous sport of bull baiting. This involved tying a bull, or sometimes a bear, to a post and having several dogs maul it to death, or die in the attempt. The sport was banned in 1835. With bull baiting banned, these dogs were sadly conscripted into another blood sport, that of dogfighting. The breeding pressure now shifted over to producing dogs that would be aggressive towards other dogs. So the pit bull was born. A little known fact is that the majority of dog breeds were created in the 19th century and often represented the interests or desire of the upper classes of a given society. Particularly wealthy individuals would breed dogs, because they could easily afford it, to generate specific characteristics or traits or even just physical appearances that they liked. Once a dog no longer had any purpose to the upper class, or just was no longer popular, it would often be discarded and fall in with the less discriminating lower classes. This is what happened to the pit bull. Although the pit bull was still used for dogfighting, the vast majority of pit bulls tended to be family pets and were no longer being bred for blood sports. Its formerly purebred genes have had well over a century of mixing to dilute the breeding done to it in the 19th century. It's also important to know that when people refer to pit bulls, that term includes at least 4 distinct breeds and several mixes. Also, boxers, Akitas, and Shar-Peis were all historically bred for fighting too, but they don't get portrayed as dangerous the way pit bulls are. So when people like Brittany Venti talk about their breeding history to paint pit bulls as inherently dangerous, it's fear-mongering, plain and simple. And the pit bull story doesn't end in the 19th century, but let's return to the video before talking about the pit bull in 20th century America. Venti tries to explain dog breeding by saying,
It's just a natural instinct that has been selectively bred by breeders. Dogs are going to do what they were bred to do. Some dogs are meant for herding, some dogs are meant for hunting, and then some dogs are meant for herding.
What I think she's trying to get across here, the English language be damned, is that she is a big believer in genetics driving behavior, and that a dog bred for a purpose is tied to that purpose, as its genes will only allow for that limited range of behavior selected by a breeder. While traits can definitely be passed on to other dogs through breeding, without that continued selection pressure, traits can often fall out of favor. Evolution doesn't stamp a finished label on any species, and some breeders have found pit bulls can lose their aggression within 2 to 3 generations, a milestone that the vast majority of pit bulls have lived past, as, and this may come as a surprise to Brittany, very few pit bulls are bred to be fighting dogs. But Brittany Venti isn't interested in that, and this video isn't about representing science, it's about getting you to believe that genes are what dictate behavior.
Pit bulls are the most dangerous dog. I'm referring to not only pit bulls, but their variations and any mixtures of them. The mixtures are even more dangerous because sometimes you won't even know it's a pit bull.
Okay, let's think this through. If pit bull genes make a dog violent, why would mixing those genes make a dog less violent? It's almost as if she's saying pit bulls will taint any other breed they're allowed to mix with. Consider what that would sound like if she were talking about human beings for a moment. But right now I'm just reading subtext. Venti clearly said the danger was because people wouldn't know the dog is half pit bull. It's almost as if she's saying the onus is on people and how they treat dogs. But hey, I'm just picking on her poor presentation skills now. There are actual bits of research that are shown throughout this video, all found on that noted academic journal, Twitter. The highlighted captions all come from Twitter user WildGoose999, some Twitter person who hides behind a bird avatar. What kind of jerk does that, right? Let's drill down on a few of the specific claims made by this guy. To keep this video reasonable in its length, I'm going to pass over some of the irrelevant ones, such as groups trying to change the name of pit bulls, thinly sourced claims about pit bull advocates being cigarette shills, or that pro-pit bull groups are secret Satanists, because none of those have anything to do with the supposed threat of pit bulls, and I don't want to waste time on them in the video. Although the Satanism one was hilariously not true. First, there's this little graph that points out that Michael Vick's conviction is some kind of catalyst for pit bull attacks. For those who may not remember, Michael Vick is a former pro football player who operated a dogfighting ring that killed a number of pit bulls. What the graph is suggesting is that pro-pit bull sentiment that came as a reaction to the story has made the public friendlier to pit bulls, and therefore more vulnerable to attacks. The numbers on this graph are compiled from this dataset. Now, the big problem with this dataset is that it is made up entirely from media reports. It's not an actual measure of dog bites across the US, but rather the ones reported by the media. The growth in anti-pit bull sentiment was heavily fueled by media coverage in the 1980s about pit bulls being out of control, and this has more or less been an old standard for local news reports across the US. The dataset also suggests dog bites are exploding, going from 731 in 2002 to 2,975 in 2013. What if we compare this to a neutral data source for a better measure, though? According to the CDC, using data from hospitals across the United States, in 2001, 368,245 people were admitted to a hospital for dog bites. So if we assume the total number of dog bites stayed the same in 2002, or let's even round it down to 360,000, the total number of bites reported in the media represent 0.2% of all dog bites. I should also point out that this bit of research wasn't peer-reviewed or published anywhere but on the website animals247.org, created by the paper's author, Merritt Clifton, a longtime anti-pit bull advocate. He has no serious academic history or credentials, and his research has largely been popularized by the very slick-looking dogsbite.org, sitting along blog posts like this one. And that's not exactly what I would call a constructive criticism of the scientific literature. There's a great blog post that drills into the numbers of Clifton's pit bull attack stats and how they often count ridiculous stories such as a horse kicking a woman after it was startled by a pit bull, or an animal control officer slipping and falling while chasing a dog as pit bull attacks. Give it a read if you want to hear some of the more ridiculous claims. These slides throw out some damning numbers, but here are two things to keep in mind. These all relate to specific communities and not national averages, and they compare singular breeds with a number of different pit bull breeds blended into a single stat. The last of the tweets Brittany Venti cites for her video is a thread where WildGoose999 discusses how it's the genetics of the pit bull that create aggressive behavior, and that owners have nothing to do with it. The first slide is from Dog Bites in Urban Children, published in Pediatrics in 1991. The first limitation of this paper is that it looks at dog bites reported in a single Philadelphia hospital in 1989, so again, you can't always generalize one community to an entire country. The next problem we run into is the actual data in the research. This table here breaks down the number of bites by breed, and we can see that pit bulls actually weren't the most common. It was the German Shepherd. The paper's discussion section, where the excerpt is taken from, does go into detail about pit bulls, but the two paragraphs shown by WildGoose999 are less connected than he might have you think. The second paragraph isn't really about pit bulls specifically, but dogs in general. The idea that genetic differences influence behavior isn't a controversial one, but to tie that influence to breed is the shell game that's being played here. Why is the only term highlighted genetic predisposition? The other factors of early socialization to people, training or maltreatment, quality of care and supervision, and behavior of the victim are also factors. Wild Goose 999 is arguing that a pit bull's behavior isn't relevant to the actions of its owner, but the non-highlighted variables would be influenced by a dog's upbringing and environment. The paper is clear that the other variables are at least as important, so why emphasize genes? Possibly because Wild Goose 999 has an agenda here, and he's willing to twist the research to get that across. Let's move on to the next one. Mortality, Mauling, and Maiming by Vicious Dogs, published in 2011 in Annals of Surgery. Now, the quote Wild Goose 999 uses is actually not from the paper he's citing. The Annals of Surgery paper is actually quoting someone from a different paper here, so let's go to that one. Dog Attacks, Deaths, and Maimings, U.S. and Canada, September 1982 to December 31st, 2013, by... Oh, it's our old friend Merritt Clifton. In fact, this paper is the same data set I debunked earlier. And if you look through the Annals of Surgery paper, it actually cites all kinds of research from dogbites.org and other bits of spurious research from Clifton that hasn't been peer-reviewed. It even includes a YouTube video as one of its sources, so technically I guess my video here has just as much academic weight. This makes me question how careful these researchers were in putting together this paper, but I'll be as charitable as possible here and say perhaps they're seeing something in Clifton's work that I'm not. Their paper closes with this passage. These breeds should be regulated in the same way in which other dangerous species, such as leopards, are regulated. I'm not sure pit bulls should be considered as dangerous as leopards, but they're the scientists, I guess. Slides 3 through 8 all come from a paper titled Are Pit Bulls Different? An analysis of the Pit Bull Terrier controversy, published in 1987 in Anthrozoos, a multidisciplinary journal of the interactions of people and animals. Now, all these points come from the same section of the paper, but even in these selected sections, Wild Goose 999's intentions are betrayed. The first slide reads, a long history of breeding for bull baiting and fighting has had a profound effect on the genetic predisposition of many of the fighting breeds. In many cases, a shorter history of selection for qualities that might make these animals suitable as household companions has counteracted this effect. Why highlight the genetic predisposition and ignore the rest of that passage? Aside from the fact that it basically contradicts everything you're trying to say in your little Twitter thread. The other slides are similarly irresponsible and do little to represent the actual findings of the paper. If I wanted to cherry pick something that showed fighting dogs were no risk to humans, I could just post this from the next page. Aggression towards people. The fighting dogs of the 19th century generally posed little or no threat to people. These animals were disqualified in the pit if they exhibited aggression to their handlers or other people. Early in this century, several former fighting breeds, such as the Bull Terrier and the English Bulldog, were specifically selected for their good dispositions around people. But what is this paper really about, and what argument is it truly making? We can find that easily enough at the end of the paper where it says, problems of irresponsible ownership are not unique to pit bulls, nor will they be in the future. For this reason, we feel that effective animal control legislation must emphasize responsible and humane ownership of sound animals, as well as responsible supervision of children and animals when they interact. So this paper isn't about the evils of pit bulls, but instead advocating for owners to be held to a higher level of responsibility. It doesn't seem like a good paper to use in a thread about how owners don't matter when it comes to pit bull aggression. The last 3 slides all come from Dog Bites to Humans, Demography, Epidemiology, Injury, and Risk, published in 2001 in Vet Med Today. This paper isn't really about pit bulls specifically, but dog bites in general. Less favorable traits could mean anything when talking about all dogs. To get more specific, a few paragraphs later the paper says, investigations of unpredictable aggression have produced no firm results regarding heritability. The next slide is a bit vague, but you might be interested to know that this comes from a section titled Issues of Fact and Myth, and the spot he cut off goes on to read, a careful reading of the literature supports 3 conclusions regarding breed. The breeds most represented in dog bite data vary over time. Breeds most often represented in published data are popular ones, and no one breed may be represented in bite data in proportion to its actual population. And pit bull is often applied without biological basis to a range of dog types, regardless of the underlying genetic stock. So the paper is pretty clear in stating that the pit bull stigma isn't because they're genetically bad dogs. And the last slide is, surprise, surprise, also misleading. Reading just a few lines above it, we can see a fuller use of the text reads, "Caution is urged regarding any generalization about inappropriate breed-specific behaviors. Selection for specific behaviors should be viewed as a risk assessment analysis. Breeds that have been selected for one or few specific behaviors may be more at risk for developing undesirable variations on those behaviors." This excerpt comes from a much larger section that, again, isn't specifically about pit bulls, but dogs in general. At best, you can try to connect this to how pit bulls may have been bred to be more aggressive to other dogs, but this part of the paper is a discussion of where more research needs to be done to minimize future dog bites. It's not saying anything about the relative danger posed by pit bulls. Whew, so all the garbage in that thread has been dealt with. It's incredibly difficult to track which dogs are responsible for dog bites, as most people aren't typically trained to identify dog breeds. Even people who work at animal shelters often mistake dog breeds. Most reports of dog bites, particularly in the media, but even in scientific literature, can mistake what breed a dog might actually be. Here are some pictures to give you an example. Can you tell which one of these is the American Pit Bull Terrier? That's one of the 4 distinct breeds. And don't worry, none of the other pictures are of the other 3 distinct pit bull breeds. If you want to think this over a bit, you should hit pause on the video because I'm going to give you exactly no seconds for that. It's this one right here.
There's even a whole paper on pit bull owners lying by omission about their dog breeds to other people. They pretend that their dog isn't bull-blooded. So they're also pretending that their dog isn't more powerful than other dogs by a long stretch and are more likely to attack. That's a very dangerous scheme to play, pit owners.
Brittany Venti brings up a paper titled "Managing the Stigma of Outlaw Breeds, a Case Study of Pit Bull Owners," published in Society and Animals in 2000. It discusses how pit bull owners often lie to others about their dog in order to avoid the stigma placed on pit bulls. The paper explicitly says owners do this not because their dogs are dangerous, but because of the social stigma attached to them. Here's a quick excerpt from the paper. Our work suggests that non-human animals also can be stigmatized, although they will not have a conscious awareness of this perception. However, as part of a human-animal team, their owners can experience the taintedness that is commensurate with this stigmatization and resort to various techniques to mitigate, prevent, or improve such adverse perceptions. Another source Brittany uses is the "What to Expect If Your Community is Discussing Breed-Specific Legislation," BSL in brackets, which isn't actually scientific research, but a set of instructions from an advocacy group to a municipal government thinking of passing breed-specific legislation. It's not peer-reviewed, there's no record of where it was published, or even who the author is. That's the bare minimum of what you need for something to even look like a proper scientific source. You may as well just use some asshole's random Twitter account as a source. The video ends with Venti reading some shitty memes, selling merch, and then advocating for breed-specific legislation.
So you guys might be asking, what's the solution to the pit problem? The first solution is to just ban pit bulls. Some places have already done this, and it is an effective way to prevent a lot of the dog maulings that happen. There's actually a GoFundMe for that if you guys wish to support it.
The CDC and the American Veterinary Medical Association are both against breed-specific legislation, citing there is no scientific evidence to support it. BSL laws in the UK were shown to have no real effect on the number of dog bites that led to hospital admissions. And in my hometown of Toronto, dog bites actually went up after pit bulls were banned. Results vary by community, but it does show how this legislation is often misguided, and the money put towards its enforcement might be more effectively used in teaching owners how to take care of their dogs. And darker still, dogs that are seized as part of BSL laws are impounded, and many of them are eventually euthanized. But you might be wondering, why is some low-grade conservative making a video about pit bulls? I hinted at elements of racism early on, and please no one hate me for this pun, but this video is a dog whistle. This guy in the comments heard it. This dog whistle is being employed by race realists, also known as racists, to propagate the idea that genetics are what drive behavior, and that if we can measure bad behavior in a specific group, it must be a product of their genes. In other words, they want you to believe that pit bulls are naturally cruel and dangerous, so you'll believe that black people, or any people of color overrepresented in crime statistics, are naturally cruel and dangerous too. The connection between pit bulls and peoples of color is just a nice way to synergize those two things. Here's the rest of the pit bull story I brought up in the beginning of the video. In the first half of the 20th century, there was a surge in love for the pit bull in the United States. The working class of the country took very fondly to pit bulls, not having the high price tag of purebreds and fitting in nicely with the idea of the tough working class. Pit bulls were beloved family pets and minor celebrities across the country. A notable example is the pit bull terrier Sergeant Stubby, who served in World War I. Things were going great for pit bulls for a few decades, but something changed in the 1970s and 80s. Guard dogs and dogfighting had become increasingly common, and so, increasingly common in the media were reports of dog bites and stories of dogfighting rings. Guard dogs were popular with Americans who felt they needed protection local law enforcement couldn't, or wouldn't, offer. This often included the urban poor, as pit bulls were relatively common and far less expensive than purebreds that cost hundreds of dollars. Pit bulls became popular with dogfighters for similar reasons. While the vast majority of pit bulls weren't tossed into fighting pits, the ones that were became prominent fixtures in press coverage, and this is where the myth of the vicious pit bull really begins. Stories of pit bull attacks, while not necessarily statistically higher than other breeds of dogs, were frequently seen in newspapers, and once this reputation was created, anyone who might need a vicious dog would be more inclined to get a pit bull and to raise it up as such. This created a cycle that got worse in the 1980s when the war on drugs began. Pit bulls were increasingly associated in media narratives with drug dealers, using them as vicious protectors. And drug dealers in the 1980s, in the minds of a white suburban readership, were black or Hispanic. Pit bulls, by proxy, got saddled with the racism that was targeted at their owners. And while some dog breeds, such as Dobermans and St. Bernards, have weathered negative public opinions after a few stories about bites, the association with drugs and some good old-fashioned racism gave pit bulls a stigma that wouldn't fade so easily.
Black males, we are America's pit bull. You know, we're labeled vicious, inhumane.
A recent news article uncovered some examples of how alt-right posters on 4chan are trying to push the pit bull meme to advance their usual racist narrative, and certain enablers, like Brittany Venti, are all too happy to help them along. Now, I don't know for sure if Brittany Venti herself is a racist. I'm not really that familiar with her work, to be honest, but she certainly is being used by them to advance a narrative. That makes this video deeply irresponsible and dangerously misleading. The story of the pit bull does have an important lesson. Genes are undoubtedly a part of our behavior, but social influences like breeding pressure don't create meaningful, lasting changes. All animals are a product of their environment and how their genes interact with it. So instead of treating a dog like a public menace, treat them with love and compassion. And don't let dog discrimination be your gateway into thinking that people who don't look like you are genetically inferior.